Hi everyone, this is Jose Anunciato. Welcome back. Today we're going to introduce how to build data-driven web applications. We're going to be using the very popular React.js library, which is a JavaScript library that allows us to build single-page applications. That means that these are dynamic web applications that can connect to servers, retrieve data, and then dynamically render them on the screen that can be run inside of any browser. To illustrate the use of this user interface library, we're going to build something really simple. We build these two screens. One of them is going to list an array of users. Right here we have Bob Ho, Tim, Dodd, Elon, and so on and so forth. Right, this is data that's going to be retrieved from a server that is exposing some data model through a RESTful API, and then we're going to be able to select one of these users, and it'll navigate to some editor that is implemented with a form that shows all the fields that you could edit for that particular record. That editor is going to allow us to add or modify an existing record, right? We can save that record, change the first name, username, and whatnot. It also allows us to delete an existing record or just cancel and go back to the list of users. If we want to create a new user, we can click on this add user and it will navigate to the user editor, but with empty input fields where we can type new data, right? And then click on create, and it'll create a brand new record. And then it'll navigate back to the user list to show that new user listed here. Okay, so this is going to be communicating with an existing database, right? That already has the tables that we're going to be interacting with. You can download it from here, and once you download it, we also have provided a project that you can use that has starting code that you can use to get started with this assignment. All right. Okay, so let's get a hold of the database. Right? If you go here and navigate, you can download the zip file. You can say download. This will download to the local file system. I've downloaded it several times already. If you click on it, it'll unzip and create a directory. There it is, DB Design 5. We can import that from MySQL. So let's go to MySQL Workbench, and we're going to blow away the old database that we already have. Let's see, it's this one right here, and it already has several tables. So I'm just going to remove everything that is in here. Right? Obviously, this needs to be done in a particular order, but let's see if I can remove. Let's see if I can refresh. Anybody? Okay, so several of them have been removed. Let's see, probably blogs we can remove. And the posts we can remove. Now we can remove the blogs. The reason they're not being removed is that they have dependencies between each other. They're referencing each other, and the database is enforcing database integrity. Right? When you have foreign keys that are referencing each other, right? You cannot delete them. There we go. Okay, so we're gone. We're good. All right. So we now have a completely empty database. We can now import the database that we just downloaded. All right. So we go to server. We can say data import. And we can navigate to the directory we just created, right? Which I believe it was in downloads, and you have I believe it was this one, right? And those are the tables that we're going to import. Yeah, it's going to import to that schema over here, and we're going to say start importing. Let's clean up this. Okay, so there it is. So we have the database. We can refresh the schema to see if the tables were loaded. Excellent. There we go. So we got the data back. You see, we can look at the content here. We got a couple of users. We have Alice, Bob, Tim, Elon, Charlie, and Daniel. And we got some other stuff here. We got blogs, and we got some posts. And for this for what we're going to be building, we're going to be interacting with this one table, users. Okay. All right. So we got that. We got the database. Let's also now download the project, the sample code. If you go here, you can download it in two different ways. You can either click on this download zip, and then you can unzip that directory and it creates a new directory with the code that you need, or you can clone it, right? If you have Git, you can do that instead. Let's do that. Let's go to terminal and let's download it somewhere here. Let's go maybe to a temp directory and let's clone this project. So let's see, so you can say git clone. There it is. So it cloned it, and it should have created a directory, and I believe it's this one right there. That wasn't there, now it's there. Okay, so let's open it up with our favorite IDE. I'm going to be using IntelliJ, but really you could use any other favorite IDE. You know, you can use Eclipse, VI, or Visual Studio Code. So we'll say open. We'll navigate to that directory. So it was, I believe it was temp. So under temp, it's this one right here. We'll say open. Okay, there it is. So it opened up. So we're going to be spending most of our time under the web app directory, which is being parsed right now. The IDE is still processing the project that it's open. Okay, there we go. So if we open that up, under the source directory, main, we have web app. Under web app, we have this starting code, which is called social. And this is where you're going to be doing most of your work. Now, if we open that up, we have the beginnings of an HTML document where we're going to be building our user interface that's going to try and connect right to this users table. It's going to try and retrieve these users over here. We're going to be able to delete users, create users, update users, and retrieve the users in there, either all of them or individually. Right. So let's see what we're giving you. Let's start with the index.html. That's going to be the entry point of our application. Right. If you right click on it, you can say run it. It opens it up in just a browser. And right now it's just showing some sample users: Thomas Sowell, Kathy Wood, Adam Smith. Right. None of this actually works. Right? The add user doesn't actually do anything. When you do click on the Thomas Sowell, it does navigate to the user editor. Okay, there it is, and notice that it doesn't show any data, right? Because again, none of this is working yet, right? We're going to be actually building this. None of these buttons actually work; they don't do anything yet, and that's going to be our focus of this assignment. So getting this up and running. Okay. Again, adding a user is going to navigate to the user editor where we can add new information for a new user, and if we click on create, it will create the new user, and then we will see it listed down here. If we click on an existing user, it'll navigate to the user editor, showing the information for that user so that you can edit the first name, last name, and so on and so forth. And then you can save any your changes, and then it would go back to this list, and you would see the changes represented here. Or if you select a user and come in and click on delete, it'll remove the record, right? And then it'll come back to the list and show that the user is no longer there. Or if you don't want to do anything and just want to go back, you just say cancel and it navigates back. Right? So that's basically implementing all the CRUD operations that you would ever want to do for a given table. Okay. All right. So let's see if we can show you how to implement these really simple user interface. Let's see what we're giving you. So we're giving you this this here. Okay. We're giving you the this index HTML document. Let's go over this real quick. Okay, so it is built using HTML. So it is an HTML document, right? We're giving you this so you don't have to write any of this, right? So we have the root of the HTML document. We have the head. Head is where you define the title of your application and also any dependencies that this document has with other documents. In particular for us, we are loading a couple of CSS libraries. This is just to spruce up the application. We don't really need them, right? We're adding it so that our application looks a little prettier, right? It adds these styling, makes the buttons look a little prettier. It adds a little margin around, right? It makes these nice lists, right? It allows you to create these nice input fields, right? And this color buttons, but we don't really need that. Nevertheless, we're giving it to you, but they're not really needed. Also, And here we have the body of the document. Right, this is where the main content is actually rendered, is what you are seeing here on the screen. Notice that it's empty. There's nothing in there. That's because we are using a technique called single page application. And single page applications dynamically inject content. They dynamically add content into this one single element, this HTML element called div with the ID root, right? And as you navigate between different screens, the screens are injected and dynamically rendered, right, into this div, right? And we'll learn how to do that in a minute. We're also plumbing for you. We're already creating for you some of the magic that happens behind the scenes, so that you don't have to, right? So we are using React.js. Now, React.js, there's usually a lot of infrastructure that you need to set up, and a lot of plumbing that needs to get done. So we're doing that for you, so you're not distracted with any of that. So these 4 files is really what allows React.js to be able to be used to implement this simple application. If you really want to know more about React.js, there's an entire course that covers all the nitty-gritty and the behind the scenes on how does it work. But for now, just these 4 files just make the magic happen. Okay. All right, so we are going to be spending our time implementing these 4 files, right? One of them is going to be this user list is going to be responsible for rendering this list of users, right? So there it is, a user list. Right now, it's rendering something that is static, right? It's not actually going out to the server, right? All this is just static content, and we'll see in a minute. But throughout the assignment, what we're going to do is that we're going to replace all that static content. We're going to replace it with dynamic content that's going to come from the server, right? We're going to go fetch data from a server, and the server is going to fetch it from a database, right? And so all these records that are listed here, listing all these users, is going to appear here. Okay, so that's going to happen. The user list is going to do that. The communication back and forth between the user interface and the server is going to be done in user service, right? Which is going to implement several functions that are going to be talking to the server and fetching all this data from the server and making it available throughout the application. Notice that we just have a couple of placeholders here. It's not really implemented. We're giving you just the names of the functions, and you're going to have to implement the actual body of these functions. And we'll show you how to do that throughout the throughout this lesson. Okay. Then we are going to also implement this user form editor, right, which is going to implement this this component that is going to allow us to edit the user. Right now, it's just showing some static input fields and labels and buttons at the bottom. It's really simple. It's just this. It's rendering this title at the top, user editor. It's rendering these labels, these input fields, label, input field, label, input field, and then these buttons at the bottom. Okay, right now it's not doing anything, it's just static. But we're going to be focusing on implementing that today. Right now it looks like it's highlighting all these. So let's turn on JavaScript. It doesn't like the version, so I'm just going to update it to a more modern version so that it understands our cool modern React.js syntax. Okay. All right, what else do we give you? So notice that all our screens or React.js components are being loaded up as scripts, right? So any new screen, any new component that you define, you would need to load it up in here and make sure that you use the correct type, the correct data type, the correct data plugins, and so on and so forth, right? That's if you want to expand on this simple UI, right? You want to add more of your own content, then definitely make sure that you declare them here. We're also declaring here in index.js, this is going to be the root of the application, and it's what is going to kick off the whole application, right? And so the way this is going to work is that the index is going to set up our 2 screens, and it's going to allow us to navigate between 2 screens, the the user list and the user form. It's going to allow us to navigate between these two screens. Okay, and if we notice that the URL here changes as we click, notice that it adds users and then slash, that's the ID of a user, and it matches, for instance, this path over here, this URL pattern, and so it loads that particular screen. Okay, so we give you that. What else do we give you? And here we have the actual rendering of the top level component, right? And which is from index, right? It loads up this function, and then this function is then we create an element out of it, right? And then the whole content is injected into this root div that we have here, right? See this div here? We are injecting all the content in there. Okay, right? And then we kick it off and start working with the actual component. All right. Just to back up a little bit, and let's show you how to just get started on a really simple hello world. All right, before we dive into the actual assignment. Okay, we do have a couple of slides that should help you get started. This is called data-driven React.js applications, right? And just goes through just a few of the concepts that you'll need. Just showing you that a couple of the libraries that are being loaded in the head, right, are for styling purposes, right? They're really optional, but here it repeats what I just said, right? That this is one of the libraries that makes things look a little more professional, right? It also makes the application responsive. Also, we are loading a library that has tons of really cool icons and fonts, right? Again, all this is optional, but it really makes the application look much prettier. Also goes through what we just described, right? That we are using some of the libraries, JavaScript libraries that we're linking here, right? Like React.js, React DOM, React Router. This is what is going to make all the magic happen, right? Of using the React.js library to render dynamic content, right? Again, you don't need to know about the details, right? We're giving you all this, and I'll just show you how to get started from scratch, okay? And then we can go on and define several other libraries, such as the service library, right? This is what we're going to be writing that allows us to communicate with the server. You can define all sorts of components. React.js allows you to build complex applications in terms of smaller components that you can then combine together to build really complex, advanced applications. Some components you can can render really small parts of a screen, or they can be complex components that can render an entire screen, right? And one of the components needs to be the root component that is responsible for loading the rest of the application, the rest of the components, the rest of the screens, right? And sets everything up and configures everything for the application. And finally, we load up the root component. We load the root component and then use React DOM to render into the root element of the application. So let me demo this for you. And so let's get started here. So let's create here a demo directory, right? Just to start off. So demo. And I'm going to copy index.html and index, just those two. Let's paste that in there. Okay. And just to simplify things, say you wanted to do this from scratch, right? And you want to build your own thing. So let's get started with our application being something as simple as just saying hello, right? So our application is just going to say hello world, okay? Right, and it has no screens. It's just as simple as just saying hello. So this is the absolute, actually even simpler. Right, in React.js, you build components either with classes or with simple functions like this one, right? So this is a simple function that when it's embedded by other components, right? It renders whatever it is that it returns. So in this case, it's returning a big size heading, right? That says hello world. And then in index, right? The top heading, the top head, right? It just loads some libraries that make it look pretty. We load here's where all the content is going to dynamically render. Right? Here are the 4 libraries that make this magic happen. We don't yet have any of these screens, so I'm just going to blow them away. We do have our index root component, right? Which we just implemented, that just renders hello world. Okay, we load the index, right? We call render, right? And we inject the content in the root. Okay, all right. So let's see. Right? If you go to index.html and say run, notice that it just says hello world. Okay, so this is absolutely the simplest of React.js components. Does this make sense? All right, so let's make this a little bit more interesting. Say we have multiple screens, right? So say we have let's create another screen. So maybe this is screen 1, and so let's see. We have again screens or components can be as small as a button, or it could be as large as a screen, right? So let's make this a a large screen component that takes up the entire screen. So this is, maybe we'll call it screen 1, and whatever this returns is what's going to render. So we'll just say h2, and this says screen 1, and then we're going to export this so that others can import them. Right? And so let's just for shucks, let's create 2 screens. So screen 1 and screen 2, because I want to illustrate for you being able to navigate between these screens. All right, and I might make another one. We'll call this one the home screen. Actually, I like to make these all lowercase. And this one, we'll say this is the home component or the home screen. And we'll export this home. Okay. All right. So in index, what we're going to do is that we can build an entire application in terms of other components, right? So for instance, here we're going to have hello. It could be as simple as just a single a line or element, or it could be the combination of many different subcomponents or sub screens, right? So let's load a couple of let's load those screens, right? So to load those screens, we need to import them. So let's import home. There it is. Let's import screen 1. There it is. And import screen 2. There we go. Right, and then we can add them here. Right, and now we can build a complex application in terms of smaller elements of that application. Right now, in return can only return one thing. Right, so it would be syntactically incorrect if I add here this. Right, notice that my IDE is telling me that something is wrong. Right, so what we're going to do is that we're going to wrap this whole thing into one single parent element, right? So that return can still return just one thing, right? So let's open up a generic div that is going to allow us to group logically these 2 sub elements, right? So there's home, we have screen 1, right, and screen 2, right? So if we render, we need to do home. We need to load these. Excuse me. See, these are 3 new screens, right? They need to be declared in the index.html, right? And because index.js loads the other 2, right? So index.js loads these other three, right? They need to be declared earlier. They need to be loaded earlier, right? So otherwise, it's going to say that index is going to say I can't find them, right? So let's load each one of these. So this will be home, right? This will be screen, and this is screen 2. There we go. So if we load that, notice that indeed we have hello world right at the top that is loading these other screens down below. Make sense? All right, but this kind of doesn't make sense, right? Because this should be individual screens, right? That you either show one screen or the other screen. You don't show all three at the same time, right? And so let's work on that. Let's work on that. We want to introduce the fact that we want to navigate between these three screens. We don't want to show them all at the same time. Okay, so to do that, right? We are going to use a library called the React Router DOM. React Router DOM. So here we have the example, right, of having these three components. And React Router DOM, right, is made available in the Windows object. There's a global object that is available throughout the browser, and you can extract what you need. In this case, we're going to extract an object. That's what these curly brackets mean. We're extracting this object, the hash router, right, from the React Router DOM, right? And the hash router is going to allow us to declare screens, right, that we want to show only one screen or another screen, right, but not all of them. All right, so let's do that. Let's copy this here. And let's declare it here in the app. Okay. And then here, what we're going to do is that instead of displaying all three, right, we're going to create a routing mechanism, right? We're going to say that hash router, right? It's going to declare several screens so that it'll show one or the other, but not all of them, right? And so we need to be able to map and say, when do we want to see which screen? When do we want to see home? When do we want to see screen 1, screen 2, right? And the way we do that is we're going to use a route. Route is going to allow us to say, well, I want to see home when I'm at the root of the application, like slash. If I haven't told you where I want to go, I want that to be the default thing that you see, the home screen. But if you navigate and click on a particular hyperlink, right, then the URL will change, and I want to navigate and show screen 1. And if I click on this other hyperlink, right, I want to navigate to screen number 2. And the way we do that is we're using route. Right? We can say route, and we say if we have the following route, that where if you see in the path, right, in the URL at the top, right, if you see a slash, right, meaning the root of the application, then we want to load the following component. We want to load the home component. You can do that, or there's a prettier syntax where you put home inside of the route. Okay. Also, we're going to use this attribute called exact, which means that this is not a partial match. We want an exact match, right? If it says slash, right? Not if it says slash following something, right? If it says exactly slash, then we want to load the home screen, right? And we can do that same thing for screen 1. We can say that if we see in the route, we see something else, maybe S1 or something, right? If we see S1 on the URL of the browser, then we want to load screen 1. Right? We're going to do the same thing with screen 2. Right? If we see whatever, I don't know, ABC, right? Then we want to load screen 2. Okay. All right. So let's go back to our browser, right? And let's reload. Let's reload. Okay. Notice that it's only showing home screen. See that? Because we are at the root. See that? This slash. This slash says that we are at the top of the root of our application, right? And so it matches this here, right? So it's only rendering home. Right? If instead we have S1, right? Notice that it shows screen 1. See that, right? because that's what we define. If you see S1, then show screen 1. If instead it sees ABC, right, notice that it shows screen 2. Make sense? Now this hello world kind of is not needed anymore. We were only showing that just as an example, right? So basically we have this, right? We have home screen, screen 1, and screen 2. All right, perfect. So we know how to navigate. Now the way I navigated was by me typing the actual URL here in the browser's URL at the top, right? Ideally, you would instead have something like hyperlinks so that I can navigate between the screens, right? So let's take a look at that. So for instance, from home, right, one of the things that we could do is create hyperlinks here, right? Again, we're going to add a couple of other elements to this, but return can only return one thing. So because we're going to add a whole bunch of other things down here, right? Let's wrap this inside of some generic component element that allows you to group together several components. Okay. All right. So we want to use a hyperlink, and we can absolutely use the regular HTML hyperlinks, A and the anchors, but we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to use again, we're going to use the React router DOM, right? So let's copy this, and what we're going to do here is that we're going to use another object inside of the React router DOM called link, which does exactly what you think it does, right? It's used to link or navigate, right? So that when you click on this hyperlink, right, it'll navigate somewhere. So for instance, we would like to be able to navigate to maybe screen 1, right, or navigate to screen 2, so that if I select screen 1, it navigates to screen 1 and screen 2. Okay, makes sense? All right. So to do that, we're going to use link. So we're going to create a link, right, that is going to allow us to either go to screen 1 and then another link that's going to allow us to go to screen 2. Okay. Now, if I click on screen 1, right, I want to be able to navigate to the following. I want to navigate to, I think we called it S1, like that, right? And whereas for screen 2, I believe it was ABC, wasn't it? It was ABC. Okay. All right. So let's take a look at that. Maybe put a break between these. All right. So there we go. We have the two screens there, right? So if we click on screen 1, notice that indeed it goes to screen 1. Or if I click on screen 2, right, it goes to screen 2, right? Ideally, we would like to be able to go back to the here. I would like to be able to go back to the home screen. Now, how do we go back? Well, we could put another link here that allows me to go home, right? That allows me to go home. And so let's take a look at that. So let's go screen 1. So in screen 1, let's show you how is it that we could navigate back, right? What we could do is use the same technique we used in the home, right? We use a link, right? And so that here we could put maybe like a back button, right? So we'll need to wrap this inside of a div. And here we could maybe put a link, right, where you have back link that goes where? Goes home / See that? All right, so let's try that. Let's load screen 1. Notice that it has a back screen link. So if I click on it, notice that it goes back to the home screen. That makes sense, right? But let me show you how to do it a different way. So here's in screen 2. So back in screen 2, right, we're going to also use the React router DOM, but instead of using a hyperlink, what we want to do is the following. Right? Notice that if I am in screen 2, I can click on the back button. See that? The back button allows me to go back home. So that would be an alternative way of doing it, right? The browser keeps a history of all the screens that you have visited, right? And it gives you this ability of being able to go back to where you were before or forward. Right? It allows you to move backwards and forwards in the history of all the pages that you've been, right? Basically what it does is that it makes a it makes a an array, right, of all these URLs at the end here, right, of where you have been, and then it allows you to navigate backwards and forwards, right, so that it replaces these, and then it shows the correct content. Right, so we want to be able to navigate throughout the history, right? So how do we do that? We want to do this. We want to use this mechanism, right, of being able to click on this and navigate forwards and backwards, right? We want to go back or forward, right? So how do we do that? Well, there is a use history. Use history from React Router DOM allows us to manipulate this history. And the way it works is that you declare a local constant. You can call it whatever you want, but a common name for the constant is history. And we can use history here as a function. And this will give you the history so you can manipulate it and use it in programmatically here. Okay. So what we're going to do here, instead of using link like we did before, which is a hyperlink, instead we're going to use a button. And we're going to navigate. We're going to navigate to the previous, or where we were when we click on that button. So here's a button, and we can say back. Right, so there's our back button, which is currently not doing anything, right? But we can say, right, that if we click on the button, we want to use history to go back, right? So let's do that. So we can say that if there is a click, so click allows you to invoke a function, right? And so let's say we can create a function, say const go back. So here's a function, right? And we want to invoke this function. Oh, equal. We want to invoke this function when we click on the back button, right? So what are we going to do with this function? We're going to use the history. We use the history to go back. So history dot back. See that? All right, so let's try it out. Let's refresh. Let's click on the back button, and it doesn't work. Wait, what? Interesting. All right, so we can take a look at the console. Let's look at the history. History has, oh, it's go back, not back. All right, so this is go back, not back. All right, so let's refresh. There we go. Notice that it goes back to the previous screen. All right, perfect. So we are able to navigate forwards and backwards between these screens. So let's go a little further, right? And so what we want to be able to do is, as the assignment asks us to do, is we want to be able to retrieve data from a data model that is exposing data at a URL, right? We want to hit that URL and retrieve that data and then render it. This is a reviewing the data model that we're working with, right? This is the table. This is a users table that we want to retrieve data from, right? And we have created a Java data model that maps all the fields, the name of the tables and whatnot, and also the primary key and the auto increment. Okay, we have provided that for you. So if you go to Java, right? If you go to models, right, you can see the user entity class, right? That it maps to the user table, the users table right here. Okay, we have also provided for you a repository for this users table, right? We're already giving this to you, right? And in particular, we have overwritten these two functions, right? That allows us to retrieve all the users and retrieve a specific user if you know their primary key, which is perfect, right? We're going to use the find all, right, to be able to render the first screen that lists all the users. And we're going to use the find user by ID so that we can retrieve that one user so that we can display that user when we navigate to the editor. Okay, so we're giving that as well. We're also giving you a DAL, right? A data access object that already knows how to talk to a database using the repository and can retrieve the list of all users, right? And or that individual user, right? If you open it up in the DAOs, you have the user, no, not this one, the ORM DAO, right? Uses the user repository, right? So that it can create users. It can create users, right? By using the user repository.save. It can find all users, right, by using the find all users that we defined here, right, which is basically a select star from users, okay? It also, we can also retrieve a single user, right? If we know their primary key, it can update a user by updating the fields from data that we can pass in as an argument. We can delete a user, right, if we know the primary key. Now notice that all these have been exposed, right, through as a REST controller, meaning that all these functions, all these methods can be accessed through HTTP requests, right? So if the URL is API/users or API/users user ID, right, then we can retrieve this data from the server. Okay, so what we're gonna be building is a client, a user interface that can use this RESTful API, right? This HTTP API to retrieve, update, delete, right, and create new records in the database. Okay, so that's the gist of the application. Okay, excellent. So let's first start by implementing maybe the user list, right? Let's implement a user list component. This will be a screen that is going to allow us to retrieve all the users. All right, so let's do that. So let's get started by creating the screen that's going to list the users. Okay. Now we have given you that. We have given it to you, but let's do it from scratch, right? So let's create here a screen here, and we'll call it the user list component. Okay. And what we're going to do is that we'll create it. It doesn't exist yet, right? So let's create it here. So a new JavaScript, and this will be user list.js. And for now, it'll just let's just display a simple heading, right? So we'll call it user list, right? This is just going to return. I'm already going to put it a div because I know we're going to put a whole bunch of stuff in there. So h2, and we'll call this user list. Okay, and we're going to export this. So export default, and then user list. All right. So we can now in the home directory, in the home, right? We can link to this brand new screen, right? So let's create a brand new link, and this will call maybe this is a user list, and this, let's say, let's put it to users. Okay, so if we click on users, we want to load that component. Okay, so that if we navigate back to here, right, to the home, we're gonna have this brand new hyperlink. But now if we click on it, notice that it's not gonna go anywhere, right? Because we didn't actually configure it, right? So we need to do one more thing. We need to go back and where we declare these routes, right? And say that if the URL has /users, we want to see this brand new component, right? So let's do that. Let's copy this. And so we want to, if the browser sees users, we want to load user list. There we go. And we're going to include it, import it. And notice that my IDE is pretty cool and imported the component automatically. It knows that that's where the user list is implemented. Okay, so let's try it out. Let's refresh. Now if I click on user list, notice that indeed it navigates to our user list. Everybody good? All right, awesome. Let's keep going. So in the user list, what do we want? We want a button and then a list, right? The button will look something like this. It'll have something like the button. Right, according to the assignment, it'll look something like this. Right, so it'll have a button at the top here, which will allow it to navigate to the user editor, and also it'll have a list down below of the users that we can retrieve from the server. Right. Okay, let's do that. So this can be, add a user, and let's see if we can render it. Okay, there's our add user, and we want a list underneath. We want a UL and a list of users. So this would be user 1, and several users. So user 2, 3, and 4. Yeah, there we go. So a couple users. Not as pretty as what we have for you here, but we can style it a little later. Okay, so let's see if we can do the first part, right? We want to be able to retrieve data. We want to retrieve these users from the server. Okay. Now the server, as I mentioned earlier, right, is exposing all that data and using the user ORM DAO. Let's see, we can get all the users. There it is. This find all users is exposing this function, right, of retrieving the data from the server, from the database, right, at this URL. Right. So let's try it out. Right, so let's run the server. Let's run it. Okay, it's running. Let's see here if the server is running at port 8080 and it's exposing the data at API users. All right, there it is. So we have Alice, Bob, Tim, Elon, Charlie, and Daniel. Right, that's exactly the data that we have in this table right here. See that? So there's 6 users, and indeed we have 6 users here. Okay. All right, perfect. This is the data that we want to access. So how do we do that? Right. So what we're going to do is that we're going to write a separate file, right, that is going to be responsible for interacting with this server. Okay, just like we have a DAO that is responsible for providing the data, we're going to have on the other side, on the user interface, we're going to have a dedicated file that is responsible for fetching the data. Okay, so the server provides the data, right, and the client, retrieves the data. Right. So let's do that. So we're going to do that here in the demo, right? We're going to have a separate file, and we're going to call it users service. Okay, and here is where we want to connect to the server, right? How are we going to do that? We want to be able to do this, right? We did this manually. We actually typed at the URL by hand, right? We want to do this programmatically instead of us doing it by hand. And so programmatically, we can retrieve this data, right, and then do something with it. So let's copy that URL. Let's bring it over here, and then let's declare a constant here. Call it, users URL, right? And we're going to just paste that in there. Perfect. Right. Then let's create a function that is kind of like the sister of this function, right? So this is the find all users on the server side, right? Let's implement one on the user interface side. Okay, so let's declare here const find all users is going to be a function, right? And what is it going to do? It's going to use that. Is going to try and fetch the data from this URL, just like we did this manually. We want to do it programmatically. So how do we do that? Well, there is a function called fetch that does exactly what you think it does, right? It goes out, if you give it a URL, it goes and fetches the data. And then once the data comes back, right, this data here, right, this data comes back from the server as an HTTP response, right? And it embeds that data inside of the HTTP body. Right? So we need to be able to parse that out, right? And then make it available as a JSON, this JSON formatted string. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, there is a magical function called then, which can take the response and can parse the response, as JSON. There we go. Okay. Now there's a lot of magic that happens behind the scenes here. I'm not going to get into it. Right. This just does exactly what you think it does. Right. It parses the stream of bits that are coming from the server, and it reconstructs that into that string that's coming from the server. It reconstructs it into a object that can be used here in JavaScript. Right. And we're going to return whatever that comes back. All right. Okay. So we're going to export this so that others can import it, right? In particular, who do we want this to import this? Well, the user list. The user list wants to use this, right? The user list is going to import that. So it's going to import the user service from excuse me, user service, there it is. And we want to be able to run the function that retrieves the data. Make sense? Now, for us to be able to use this, we need to include it inside of our, we need to load it, right? We need to load the file before we use it here. So users service, there it is. So in user list, what we want to do is that when we load, when the user list first load, right, when it's ready to render this on the user interface, what we're going to do is that we want to kick off a query of this user service, right, and then store it. Excuse me. We want to store it in a local variable here so that we can then render it here in the user interface. Okay. Okay, so let's do that, right? Let's declare here a function that we can kick off, right, when we load, so that we can then fetch that data. So we need a couple things, right? We need a place to put the data once it comes back from the server, right? We need a function that actually kicks off the user service, and we need to notify that this is a good time to do it, right, when it loads. So how do we do that? Right, so we want is a function here that is going to be called same thing, find all users, right, that we can kick off, right, that can go and fetch, right, find all users, and then store them somewhere in a local variable, right? So we need that local variable, right? So for instance, we need something like, I don't know, like users, a function called users, right? That is some array that is populated by this find all users, so that we can then iterate over those users here. So how do we do that? All right. So what we're going to do is that we're going to use a very modern mechanism in React.js called React hooks, right? That allows us to maintain state, like state variables, right? Allows us to declare these state variables inside of this function, and also is going to allow us to kick off things that happen at unload time, right, when the components first boots up, right? So to do that, right, I have a cheat sheet here that is going to allow us to do that. Okay, so the first one is using use state. Use state is going to allow us to declare local variables, local state variables, right? So let's do that, like that. And use state is going to allow us to declare this user's state variable, right? So let's do that. So we're going to do const users and set users, right, from use state. Okay. So what we're doing here is that we're declaring two things. One is the data where we're going to be holding the data, right? Which in this case is going to be populated by whatever find all users comes back with, right? We're going to store the data in there. And set user is a mutator, right? It's a function that allows us to change or initialize the values of users. So users is kind of like the data, and set users is the function that allows it to modify that data. Okay, right? And use state takes as argument an initial value for users, right? So we're going to initialize the users as an empty array, right? We don't have any users, and we need to populate it with whatever find all users comes back with. Okay. All right. The next thing that we need to do is be able to kick off this find. Sorry. And so let's populate users, right? Let's populate users with whatever the server comes back with, whatever the response of find all users. Remember, find all users is parsing the data coming back from the server, right, and back into its original JSON representation, which happens to be an array of users. There it is. See, it's an array. The square bracket means this is an array of objects. Okay, right? So let's do that. So what we're going to do here is that once, it's going to take a while to parse and convert that into a JSON object. Once it's done parsing it out, right, it's going to notify us and give us the actual data, right, the data. that we know that data is the users, right? So we're going to, well, this is going to be a function, basically a function, an inside function, right? An anonymous function that we're going to call set users, and we know that the data that is coming back, right, is the actual users, that array of users. So we're going to set the users to be that data that came back from the server. Now users has data, right? Well, not quite yet. We need to be able to kick off, right, and run this find all users when the component loads, right? We need to be able to be notified that this is a good time to actually do this, right? So how do we do that? Well, just like there's a use state for maintaining state, there's also another one that we can use, another hook that we can use to be notified, right, when the component first loads, kind of like a constructor, right, or like an init. It's a good time for initializing ourselves, right? So it's called use effect. Okay, and use effect is going to be invoked. It's a function that is going to be invoked, right? And it takes as argument an anonymous function, like a lambda function here, that's going to be invoked to notify you, hey, this is a good time for you to initialize yourself, right? How are we going to initialize yourself? Well, we're going to call this find all users. We're going to kick off and call find all users. Find all users is going to fetch the data, right, from the server, is going to provide it to us, and we're going to set our local state variable over here, right? And then we want to be able to render here our state variable, right? So let's see if this actually works. Let's see if this blows up. Okay, so let's refresh. Okay, notice that we haven't seen anything, but we should be able to see if we inspect, we can see the chatter between the this user interface and whatever the server is saying, right? So if we look at the network traffic, oh, it's going into an infinite loop. Okay, this needs to be told not to go into an infinite loop, and we do that by putting this square brackets here. Let's do that. There we go. Okay, it only happens once. Okay, there's a query that goes out to the server. See that? There's the query that goes out to the server, API users, which is this same query that we did and we typed here by hand. See that? But now it's happening programmatically, right? And look at the response. See that? That's what's coming back from the server. This long string, right, that is formatted as JSON. Our code is going to parse it and try to make some sense out of this crazy long string. It's going to convert it into a nice JSON array, right? That that has all these properties, name, value pairs, and whatnot, right? And so we do have the data. We do have the data. We're going to try and render it. Let's try and render it. So here we can print out to the screen here. We can print out the actual JSON as a string, right? So that we can just look at it, see what it looks like. So let's print it down below here. So to inject that, notice that up to this point, right, all this has been static content, right? It's just just simple HTML elements or tags, right, that are not changing, right? They're all static. But we can inject data, dynamic content, right, by embedding JavaScript logic, right, that allows us to dynamically generate things, right? And we do that by using the escape characters curly bracket, right? So curly brackets allows us to put dynamic content in here. So for instance, one of the things that we might want to do is use a function called JSON stringify. What it does is that if you take any data, if you take any data that is already an object, right, it converts it into an equivalent string. Okay, so our users presumably is that big array, right, that has been set, right, and let's put it in here, right. So if we refresh, notice that there it is. See that? There's our array. There's our array with a whole bunch of objects in there, right, with all the data in there. Okay. What else can we do? For instance, we can take users as a variable. Now that it's an array, right? We could escape here in user list, right? We can escape again, embed dynamic content, right? And we can reference that variable and get a hold of a couple things in there. For instance, since it's an array, it should have a length attribute, right, of how many elements in that array, right? So if we refresh, notice that it shows 6. See that? So indeed we have the data. We have the data here in the user interface. We just need to be able to dynamically render that data here, right? Notice that all those objects, if we iterate over the elements in the array, notice that we have an ID, we have a first name, we have a last name, we have a username. Let's print these 3, right? The username, the first name, last name, and username. How's that? Let's do that. All right, so how do we do that dynamically? Again, we use the curly brackets as escape characters back into code, right? So that we can dynamically generate content. Okay, so let's do that. Let's put a curly bracket here. Now, this is going to be just more than just a single variable, right? It's going to be, we have to iterate over the array, right? We need to, generate content, right? So it's going to be pretty long, right? So we're going to give ourselves some more space, right? So it's not just a single line like we did over here, right? It's going to be something a little more complex. All right, so what do we want to do here? So what we want to be able to do is generate these line items dynamically, right, as we iterate through the list of the array, right? Which array? It's the users array, right? We want to iterate over it. So how do we iterate? JavaScript has several iterators, right? There's for each, right? There's you can filter over them. You can find things over an array. One of the functions, a very useful function, is called map. So what map does is that it iterates over the array one at a time, okay? And it calls a function. By passing you every single element in the array one at a time, right? So for instance, it passes the anonymous function, it passes you each user, okay? And then you can do whatever you want with it. Now, whatever you return from this function, is what is going to concatenate. It's going to concatenate all that you return, right? And it's going to put it as the output of whatever that is. So this evaluates to the concatenation of whatever each of these function returns, right? So for instance, let's actually do it here. Let's copy this here. Let's put it here, and let me just show you. Okay. So for instance, if we return user dot ID, say, right? Look what happens. Oops, user list. There it is. See that? Look at that, right? It's basically just concatenating each one of the IDs. See that? 1, 2, 3. See that? So it's just concatenating and making it into one long string. Okay, and you can do that with any field, right? You can say also first name. I spelled it, first name. There it is. See that? Alice, Bob, Tim. So it's just concatenating all of them. So we want to do something a little more interesting, all right? So for instance, instead of just returning just a simple string, what we want to return is this, right? One of these guys. Right? We want to return an entire li, right? That we can concatenate one after another, right? With some data in there. Okay, so let's put this back in here. Let's put that back in here. So instead of returning this simple first name, what we want to return is something like this, right? So let's copy one of these. So because we're going to return something a little more complex, we're going to put this in parentheses. Okay. So we're going to open ourselves in a big parentheses, and we're going to paste that li. See that? All right. Let's see what happens here. Let's refresh. All right. Look at that. Right. We have user 1 repeated 6 times, right? Plus the dynamic one, the static one that was already there. These guys. So since this is static, we can do away with this, right? Do away with this. If we refresh, there it is, user 1, and so on and so forth. See that? So we are, for each one of the users that we are iterating over, we're just returning over and over and over the same content. But that's kind of boring. We don't want that, right? What we like to be able to do is here, we want to display something about the user, the actual user, right? So, well, we have a user variable here, right? So let's give ourselves a little more space here. Right? So again, we can escape. We can escape the HTML back into code. We can say user, and we can say maybe the first name. See that? right? So now we have the first name. Perfect. See, Alice, Bob, Tim, Elon, Charlie, and Daniel. Okay. And we can display other things, right? Maybe the ID, first name, and last name. There it is. So we have one Alice, Wonderland, and whatnot. See that? Right? Obviously, we can maybe put some commas or something. Okay, there we have it. So there it is. So we were able to retrieve data from a remote server, right? And then just display it here, which is perfect. It is exactly what we wanted to do, right? Again, we don't need this JSON stringify anymore. All right, perfect, excellent. What about we would like to be able to edit this user, right? And maybe retrieve the data for this user, for an individual user, as we go maybe into an editor field that would allow us to edit it, right? So let's try and do that, right? So to do that, we're going to create another component, right? That is going to allow us to edit that user, okay? But we need to somehow pass it, right? We're going to pass this enough information to that component so that it knows which one are you talking about, right? So that we can retrieve just Alice or Bob or Hope, retrieve the original information, populate a form so that we can edit the form, right? So let's do that. Let's first work on being able to just navigate to that editor, right? So let's create another component and we'll navigate to it, right? When we click on one of these users. So let's do that. Right, so let's create another component. And let's see, this is going to be user editor, and this is going to be a function, so const user editor, and we're going to return a div, and this is going to be h2 user editor, okay? And this is going to export default user editor. Perfect. Okay, so we have to remember to, any new screen that we load, we need to declare it. So this is going to be user editor. Perfect. Notice that I'm defining it after the service, right? Because the editor is going to need the service, right? It's going to need to make a query to the server to fetch, individual items, right? Individual users. Okay. So that's why I declare it after the service. Okay, so both of these, user list and user editor, are both going to be using the user service, so they're both declared afterwards. Okay. All right, so we have that. We also need to navigate to it. So let's declare it here. Let's declare let's map it to something. All right, so we're going to create a new route. We're going to say, okay, so we want to navigate to user editor if the URL looks like /users, and then we're going to pass as part of the path, as part of the URL, we're going to pass the ID of the user, right? So this will be : user ID. Notice the colon, right? This means that this is really a placeholder, right? It's not a hard-coded string, right? What we're going to be able to do is that we're going to encode the ID of the user that we want to edit as part of the path, so that then the user editor can take that user ID, fetch that particular user, and then render it here, okay? All right, so let's do that. So first, let's see if we can even navigate there, right? So we want to be able to, in the user list, we want to maybe click on one of these users and then navigate to the editor, right? All right, so we'll need the link. We'll need the link. Right? Let's see the link. Let's copy the link here in the user editor. So in here, we're going to include the link. Oh, not the editor, sorry, in the user list. All right, so that we can now create a link out of these each one of these users, right? We'll put this inside of a link. We'll put this inside of a link so that if we click any part of the user information, we're going to navigate where? We want to navigate to the editor, right? And so now the editor, right? It's mapped to what? It's mapped to users followed by the ID of the user, right? We have the user ID, there it is, right? So we need to create here a string which starts with users and then follows, right, with user ID embedded in here, okay? We could use string concatenation, but it's gonna look ugly. So instead, right, I'm gonna use backticks, okay? And we're gonna do an escape. We're gonna escape back to JavaScript, right? Because we want to calculate dynamically this string, right? It's not going to be a hard-coded string, right? It's going to start off with users, and then it's going to end with the following expression. It's going to end with user.id. See that? Okay. All right. So let's take a look at it. If we refresh, notice that if I hover over these, right, at the bottom of the screen, down here, right, you can see that it's /users /1 /2 /3 /4. See that? So if I click on it, notice that it navigates to the user editor. Perfect, right? And notice that the ID is embedded in the path, right? So we can presumably retrieve that user ID and retrieve the information for that particular user and display it here, right? Okay. All right. Let's try doing that. Let's try doing that, right? So we do have in the repository, in the user repository, right? We do have find user by ID, right? If we have user find by user ID, which is being exposed as a URL right here. So this find user by ID, which uses a repository to find that user by its ID, and it's mapped to /API users and user ID, meaning that we should be able to retrieve a particular user. So say I will return Bob, I should be able to say just users /2, and it returns Bob, right, from the database, right? It does a select star from users where ID equal 2, right, and it retrieves this one record. So we want to be able to do this dynamically, right, not manual like we just did, right? So where do we do that? Remember, we do any communication to the server, we do it in the service file, right? So let's go back to the service file and let's do that, right? So let's go back to the service here, and let's implement the sister of this, right? The mirror image, right? This is on the server side. We're going to create one on the UI user interface side, right? So we're going to create here a const find user by ID. If you pass me the ID of the user, right? We're going to do the same thing. We're going to fetch. It's going to look very similar to this, right? But we need to append the user ID at the end over here, right? So the way we're going to do that is that we're going to make this into an expression, into a string template, right? That we can do string concatenation like this, right? So users URL, and then so at the end, we're going to put the UID. All right. This is going to go fetch the data. It's going to come back with a response from the server, which is going to be this. It's going to be this, right? This right here is going to come back from the server. We're going to parse it and convert it into a JSON object so that we can use it and render it in the user interface. Okay, we're going to export this so that we can import it from the editor. All right, so back in the editor, we want to be able to retrieve that user. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, right, we need to import that service, right? So we're going to import the user's service from user service, perfect. And we want to be able to call, we want to have a little function here that we can invoke, find user by ID, that we can invoke, right, and call user's service, find user service, right? And presumably we can pass in some ID here for the user, and we can pass it down and then store it in a local variable, in a local state variable. And we know how to do that, right? We know how to declare a local state variable, right? We can take the, right, just like we did earlier, we can use this use effect and use state, right? Just like we did earlier, right? To declare a local state variable. In this case, the state variable is the user, the actual user we want to render, right? We want to set user. These are going to be the use state, right? Which is going to be, we're going to initialize the user object as an empty object. So we're not going to have any data. When are we going to retrieve this? When we first load, right? We're going to say use effect, right? Is going to be a function that's going to be invoked so that we can call the find user by ID, right? But one of the things that we're missing is the actual user ID. Where do we get that? Where do we get that user ID? We don't have that, right? Right. So we need to do one more thing. We need to be able to parse. We need to be able to parse this one right here from the path. We need to parse it so that we can then use it locally here. So how do we do that? Right. So to do that, okay, in React Router DOM, we have the functionality to do that, right? Using what is called use params. Use params is going to allow us to parse this URL. And allow us to parse the parameters in the URL. See that? One here is the parameter, right? As part of a path or URL, which was declared where? I believe we declared it in index, right? We declared the path as this, right? And this matches what? It matches this. That's why we are showing the user editor, right? If it matches this, right, we're going to display the user editor, right? But notice that as part of the path, we declared a variable, like a path variable or path parameter, right, call user ID. So we want to be able to parse this placeholder, which we called user ID. How do we parse that user ID parameter, right? Well, from the editor, we can use this use params to parse the user ID, right? We can extract use params, right? And then we can extract whatever we want from the use params, not user params, okay? Now we can use the user ID here and then pass it along and retrieve it. Make sense? All right, let's try it out, see if this blows up. Oh, another thing, right? We want to make sure we're not going to go into an infinite loop. Okay, so let's do it. Okay, there it is. I think this is the URL. If we click on it, notice that indeed, right, this was the URL that went out to the server, right? API users 1. Notice that instead of us typing it manually, we did it programmatically, and the server is responding with its long JSON object, right? And it's being parsed locally as this, right? And we are setting it where? You know, when we retrieve it, we're not doing anything with it, right? What do we want to do? We want to set the user. We want to set the user with the information of the data that came back from the server. So then, right? So this is the data that came back. I'm going to say set the user with the data that came back. Okay. And we know it's the user, so let's print it out here. See the JSON that came back. So JSON.stringify the user. All right, let's see what comes back. There it is. There's Alice. See that? There's Alice. If we go back and click on Daniel, note it's Daniel. All right, if I go back and click on Elon, there's Elon. See that? Perfect. Excellent. We want to now render this as a form. All right, so let's go and render it as a form. Right, so here, instead of rendering as just a JSON string, let's do the following, right? Let's create a couple of labels, right? And this is maybe the ID, the user ID, right? And then display an input field whose value for the input field is going to be user.id. Okay? And let's just display a couple of things. So we could be the first name, So this would be user first name, right? And this could be the last name, all right? And this is the last name, and this could be username, and this could be username over here. Okay. Okay, let's render this again. All right, so it's looking like a form. Notice that the data has been populated, right? But it looks a little ugly, right? So we can add a break, right? Let's add a break here. Okay, so that's starting to look like what we are looking for, right? This form over here, right? Right now we don't have all these buttons at the bottom, right? But it's starting to look promising, right? We need to be able to, edit this or maybe cancel out of this, right, and go back, right? So yeah, let's do that. Let's implement the cancel. So how do we cancel? We could put a button here that would allow us to maybe go back, right? We know how to do that already. Remember that? We can in the router DOM, we also have what? We have use history, right? We have use history that we can retrieve here. We can say const history, use history, like that. So that if we declare a new button here, that can say maybe cancel, right? Something like button that says cancel. We can say that, on click, right? We want to do what? We want to go back. We're going to say history dot go back. See that? Right? So let's try that. So if we refresh, we have the button. We can cancel. Notice that it goes back, and now we can navigate back and forth, right? And take a look at each one individually. Okay. All right. Excellent. So next we'll focus on being able to edit this or create new users or delete existing users, and we'll do that next.